Hello everyone, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the T-43, a prototype medium tank that was developed by the Soviets during World War II as a response to the overwhelming losses that they were facing against the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs of the German army. The Soviet army was looking for another tank to replace the T-34 and KV-1. This new tank had to fulfill both of the roles of the tanks that the new tank was replacing, being mobile enough to engage enemies in rapid flanking maneuvers, whilst also being heavily armoured enough to withstand enemy guns. The T-43, however, wouldn't be produced in any sort of numbers outside of one prototype, and the project would later be abandoned in favour of the development of the T-34-85. But let's now discuss on the history of the T-43. Now, before I get into the overall history of the T-43, it is first important for context to lay down what the type of problems that were being faced by the Soviet army in operating the T-34 during the time of 1941. Most of these problems mostly stem from the manufacturing problems / defects of the T-34's production, due to the rather extreme extent of corner cutting that took place to increase the number of tanks that were being made. But with regards to discussing the problems of the T-34, I could go on for hours without even stopping, to the point where it would make both the German Panther and Tiger tanks seem far more reliable, which they often were in comparison to the T-34. But that will be saved for the eventual video when I cover the T-34 in full. But for this video, I would explain in brief on the type of problems that were being encountered with the T-34. One of the main problems that affected the T-34 was often mechanical failure, that stemmed from very much of no quality control in a lot of areas of the T-34's construction. One of the most affected parts of the construction was the transmission, often being one of the components that quite literally tore itself apart due to the fact that quite often the metals that were used for the transmission wasn't heat treated, and so wear and tear on the transmission was often very ferocious, with it breaking down after only travelling 50 miles. The durability on the transmission was so bad that spare transmissions and parts were often carried on the back of the tank. In fact, the tank's losses due to mechanical problems was so bad that Stalin himself ordered that any tank leaving the battlefield would have to be checked by a technician. This was because the Soviet High Command and Stalin thought a large amount of the tanks that were being used by the Soviet army was being destroyed by traitors and saboteurs, when in reality it was just the tanks being poorly built. This order was in response to the report from 12 Soviet tank brigades over the course of 6 days, losing a total number of 326 tanks out of a total 400 tanks that they fielded. 260 of them was due to mechanical failure. In fact, it was not uncommon for a Soviet tank brigade to lose 40% of their tanks to just mechanical failures. And when the T-34 did eventually enter into battle, their luck was even worse, as they were often being knocked out by German guns. Around 54.3% of the T-34s that were being destroyed in combat were lost to the Panzer IIIs with the 50mm gun. A gun which, on paper, shouldn't be knocking out the T-34s in large amount of numbers. The reason for this was the type of steel that the T-34 used for its armour, which was heat treated to around 600 Brunel. By heat treating the steel plate to that high of a rating made the process of hardening the steel plates much faster, and it made the tank armour very hard, but at the extreme cost of a very brittle structure, excessively prone to shattering and spoiling as soon as it was hit by a cannon shell. and often you would find the armor of the wrecked T-34s looking like it had been shattered like a hammer hitting a plastic box. This particular problem plagued most of the T-34s that were produced during the war, and even the ones that were produced after the war still had the problem. Another problem that the Soviet army encountered, whilst not being the T-34's own fault, was the downright atrocious state of Soviet logistics lines in 1941 and 1942. Often most of the Soviet soldiers fielded in the various battles wasn't supplied with large amounts of ammo, fuel, food, spare parts for the defensive lines. Not because they were produced, but because the supplies weren't delivered to them, given over the fact that most of the officers and good commanders that were trained and competent enough to establish a proper logistics line was either dead or rotting away in the Gulag thanks to the various Red Purges under Stalin. In fact, the war for the Soviets was proceeding so utterly poorly that many of the former Soviet officers that were in the gulags thanks to the various purges of the military structure were then taken out for gulags to serve once more in the Soviet military. But this was not done until after the disastrous fall of Soviet defense lines at the Battle of Barbarossa. With the battle reports streaming in to the Soviet High Command after the Battle of Barbarossa, a few things started to be noticed, and one of them was the amount of T-34s that were being lost. Within 1941 alone, the Soviets had lost around 2,300 T-34s, and the rate of the T-34s that were still being lost continued to be reported to Soviet High Command. Plus, with the introduction of the Lombard 7.5cm Panzer IVs that could take out a T-34 from much longer ranges, meant that the T-34 was falling behind in terms of its effectiveness on the battlefield. And so there would be an order made by the Soviet Main Doctorate of Armed Forces, or abbreviated as GABTU, which ordered the Morozov Design Bureau to think up of a new design that would be better able to fight against the German army. The solution they would end up coming up with would be a new tank that would be effectively a T-34, but it would feature some numerous improvements to make the tank more capable. This tank would be later known as the T-43. It would be designed from the offset to replace both the KV-1 and T-34 as a universal tank. There would also be another design that was also competing, and that was the KV-13. Now, with regards to the improvements that the T-43 featured over the base model of the T-34, was that it featured a new type of suspension, namely a torsion bar suspension. The T-34 used a Christie's type suspension, which gave the T-34 a theoretical top speed of 53 km per hour on road, but the usage of the suspension came with a few problems. The first problem was that it was rather space inefficient, and it took up a large amount of the internal room within the T-34. Factory 183, which was the same factory that built more than 50% of all T-34s that were used in the war, investigated on how much space could be saved from using a torsion bar suspension over the Christie suspension. And they figured out that a total amount of 20% extra internal space would be made available on the T-34 if they used a torsion bar suspension. The second problem with the Christie suspension was the cross-country performance, which was often very poor at the best of times, and in the rather undeveloped lands of Soviet territory, which was often fast, the Christie suspension often performed quite terribly. The third problem was that it was nearly impossible to fire the tank on the move, as the tank would be rocking back and forth too much on uneven terrain. And even when the tank stopped, it would take quite a bit of time for the tanks to stop rocking back and forth. The fourth problem would be maintenance of the Christie suspension, as the various components of the T-34, like the road wheels, would have to be removed along with the armour in order to repair the suspension, which was often a very time-consuming affair, which any nation that operated tanks that used the Christie suspension would attest to. The fifth reason was due to the materials that were used and were available at the time, often not suited for use in the Christie suspension. Plus, the materials that were on hand and used in the Christie suspension by the Soviets was also hampered by the corner-cutting manufacturer of the T-34, which led to the T-34 suspension having a rather short lifetime. The other improvements the T-43 featured was the addition of a new 5-stage gearbox, which would improve the overall mobility of the tank over the 4-stage gearbox in the T-34. Now, with regards to the 4-stage gearbox mounted on the T-34, it was beyond atrocious to operate, with the gear shift from 2nd to 3rd was being noted as being very heavy, and the gear shifts between switching from 3rd to 4th gear being reported and pretty much confirmed to be near impossible. In fact, crews of the T-34 would only be able to reach 4th gear if they were travelling on road, and that was often with the help of a mallet. But when the T-34 was travelling on off-road terrain, it would normally be operating on 1st and 2nd gear, giving the tank a top speed of only 15 km an hour off-road, which is even slower than the Tiger tank travelling off-road. Another change from the T-34 was the introduction of a new 3-man turret design, as the turret design on the T-34 was largely unchanged from the design of the A-20 and A-32. These tanks were designed with the mountings for a smaller 45mm gun and the short-barreled 76.2mm L11 guns respectively. Both of these guns were smaller than the 76.2mm F-34 gun, which would be mounted on the T-34 after 1940, which was one of the compounding reasons on the cramped conditions of the T-34's turret. With the introduction of a larger turret meant that it would be less cramped to operate the main gun. The commander would be positioned at the back of the turret in an elevated spot to help him spot enemy targets at a slightly higher point. This also meant that the commander can just focus on commanding the crew, whilst the gunner would be supported by a dedicated loader, which meant that the responsibility would end up being split, which would ease the workload on the crew members of the tank. With regards to the overall specifications of the T-43, the T-43 had a length of 8.1 meters. The width was around 3 meters and the height being around 2.58 meters. It was armed with a F-34 76.2mm main gun, two 7.62mm machine guns, with one located on the barrel of the tank and one on the turret of the tank. The weight of the T-43 was around 34 tons, and powering the T-43 was the same 500 horsepower engine that was mounted on the T-34, which gave it a max road speed of 50 km per hour, and I do not doubt that the off-road speed would be as terrible as the T-34 with the 4-stage gearbox. During the testing of the T-43, it had proved even more capable than the T-34, with the incorporation of the improvements, as well as the additional armour, being praised, as the armour could certainly withstand the power of the 75mm long-barreled guns that would be mounted on the Panzer IV. But, however, there would be numerous problems why this tank would ultimately never be adopted. One of the main problems that were often cited was the practicality of introducing a new design, as you need to spend time and resources to retool the factories that were producing the T-34 and KV-1s for the production of the T-43, which was deemed by the Soviets to be not worth the effort, as the Soviets wanted to keep the tank production numbers high whilst increasing it quarter by quarter. Another problem with the T-43 is that it might be hit with the same problem as the T-34, with the various factories cutting corners in order to fulfill the ever-increasing demands of the Soviet army near black hole demand for tanks. Though one can say if the tanks didn't cut corners with the production of the T-34 and had switched from using 600 Brunel strength steel to a lower Brunel rating, such as 300, like what the Allied forces were heat treating their steel to, and then the dangers of the armour shattering like glass when it was hit by an enemy shell and the spalling that would happen would be reduced, and perhaps then the absolute demands for more tanks would be less monstrous than what they actually were, and the battlefield losses of the T-34 would be less terrible. It was not until the various battles on the Leningrad front when the first appearance of the Tiger tank made itself known to the Soviet army during January of 1943. Then after the Battle of Kursk, the reports came in detailing the increased appearance of the new German Panther tank, as well as a further increase in the number of Tiger tanks being fielded against the Soviets. These reports would then be viewed by the Soviet High Command and the State Defense Committee, which, upon reviewing the information and realizing that they would both need a quicker and more powerful answer to the new problems that were appearing, decided that the T-43 prototype would then be dropped and another option would be chosen. This other option was for the T-34 to be equipped with a more powerful 85mm gun. However, the turret of the T-34 was already quite cramped with the 76mm main gun, and so a new turret design was needed for the mounting of the 85mm gun. The T-43's turret would be used for the basis of the new turret design, for what would be mounted on the T-34. The new turret was then first tested on the T-43 with the 85mm gun, and after the test was completed, the turret would then be tested on the T-34, which it would perform adequately for it to be given the go-ahead for manufacture, forming what we know as the T-34-85, which would ultimately become one of the most recognizable versions of T-34 known in the world. After the tests were all completed, the information on what happened to the T-43 is unknown regarding the fate of the tank. Whether it's been sold for scrap, we do not know. And that was the history on the prototype of the T-43. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please click the like button and subscribe to get notified on when my next video drops. If you have any questions or suggestions for a video that you want to ask, please comment down in the pinned section down below. Now I hope you all have a good day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.